Just have to acknowledge it. You know.
Absolutely.
It's mandatory.
Yeah. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So as you guys know, much of my professional life was spent in the recovery field, and I continue to do that part-time in my retirement. And one of the things that we always would teach is, hey, you know what, trying to live a different lifestyle is really a way of life. I always used to talk to people about, you know, we don't get that instruction manual when we come into the world. You know, people always say, gosh, if we just gotten a book on how to live, maybe I wouldn't have made some of the mistakes I made, or I would have done things differently. And the fact is, I think there were a whole bunch of books like that. And I want to share with you this morning from Ecclesiastes. And I think it's because this idea of all the grasping that we do, that just doesn't bear fruit. And I was trying to get my wife down here. I couldn't get things to line up just right. She has a song called Chasing the Wind. It's about a woman who spends all of her teen years and most of her life trying to find love because that's going to somehow fulfill her, and actually in the end never does. So we're chasing the wind. So let me start off just by saying that Ecclesiastes is wisdom from maybe 3,000 years ago or so. They're not exactly sure who wrote it. Some say Solomon did. But he starts off with this really cheerful introduction. Everything is meaningless. Utterly meaningless. What do people get for all their hard work? Generations come and go, but nothing really changes. The sun rises and sets and hurries around to rise again. The wind blows south and north, here and there, twisting back and forth, getting nowhere. The rivers run into the sea, but the sea is never full. Then the water returns again to the rivers and flows again into the sea. Everything is so weary and tiresome. No matter how much we see, we are never satisfied. No matter how much we hear, we are not content. History merely repeats itself. It has all been done before. Nothing under the sun is truly new. What can you point to that is new? Of course, this is prior to cell phones, satellites, etc. But how do you know it didn't already exist long ago? Maybe we don't. We don't remember what happened in those former times, and in future generations, no one will remember what we are doing now.
Okay, let's go home.
Oh, okay.
Be sad.
Yeah, right. And then he goes on to describe, okay, but you know what? I have to figure this out. I've got to see how I can find meaning so that life doesn't feel meaningless. So he starts off and talks about seeking wisdom. I want to get all the answers. And that ends up being futile as well. Because what he noted was, the more I know, the sadder I get. Because I understand life and life's suffering so much more. Besides, the same thing happens to a wise person as happens to an unwise person. In the end, we all die. So what in the world am I doing trying to be the smartest guy? You know what? I think this pleasure idea holds some promise. So he talks about having all the concubines and all the wines and all building up his pleasurable pursuits. And in the end, decides, I looked at everything I'd worked so hard to accomplish and it was all meaningless. Like chasing the wind, there was nothing really worthwhile in it. And he says, work. That must be it. Work. I'll work hard. And he works 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 and he finally says, you know what? This isn't doing much for me either. Said, so I decided there's nothing better than just to enjoy food and drink and find satisfaction in the people I'm hanging around with. And then in Ecclesiastes, we then get this Mama and Papa songs. Mama's and Papa song. I remember the first time I read this in the Bible, I was like, wait a second. I thought Mama Cass wrote that. But it's been around a long time. It's that thing about for every season.
Right.
There's a time for every season.
Yeah.
Okay. He talks about the injustices of life. And it makes me think, not so much has changed in all these years. Life gets lifey, and we have to figure out how to navigate it. He talks about the futility of political power. And he says, you might really work your way to the top, but you know what? The young people coming behind you are going to get rid of you and install their own person, and then you'll be forgotten. The futility of wealth. I said, you can accumulate all the money you want, and in the end, you don't get to take it with you. In fact, you have to leave it behind to your kids, and who knows what they're going to do with it. It sounds a little bit like he's bitter about having his kids blow his money, but the idea is, again, where is the satisfaction in this, right? Let's get to this place where he says toward the end, at the very end, he goes, death comes to all. He says, this too I carefully explored, even though the actions of godly and wise people are in God's hands. No one knows whether or not God will show them favor in this life. The same destiny ultimately awaits everyone, whether they are righteous or wicked, good or bad, ceremonially clean or unclean, religious or irreligious. Good people receive the same treatment as sinners, and people who take oaths are treated like people who don't. It seems so tragic that one fate comes to us all. That is why people are not now more careful to be good. Instead, they choose this or that, for they have no hope. There's nothing ahead but death. Anyway, there's a certain universalist slant to that. The same thing is going to happen to all of us, and that's kind of a drag. I remember a lady at one time when I was talking to her about it, she wanted me to come to her church. And I said, I can't come this time, but I appreciate the invitation. And she goes, well, what denomination are you anyway? I said, well, I'm Unitarian Universalist. And what I think she heard me say was I'm a Kiwanian. But she said, well, what is that? What is that? And then I told her, and I said, the Universalist part is we believe we're a brotherhood, a universal brotherhood and sisterhood of spiritual seekers, and that there isn't heaven or hell. And it was like she put her cup down. No hell. There's no hell. Why in the world would people behave? And she meant it in her heart of hearts. And I just wanted to say, because we want to be ethical. We want to be moral. We want to have compassion and empathy and justice. But that's not something that a lot of people believe. For some reason, that fear of going to hell is what many people believe. It's what makes us behave right. In the end, he says, after examining all of this, the complexity and futility of life, the seeming futility of life, in the end, I've decided there are some redeeming parts. Thank goodness. He says, companionship, connection to other people. Let me read to you what he says about companionship. And you hear this sometimes at weddings. It says, I observed yet another example of meaningless in our world. This is the case of a man who's all alone. Two people can accomplish more than twice as much as one. They get a better return for their labor. If one person falls, the other can reach out and help. But people who are alone when they fall are in real trouble. And on a cold night, Two under the same blanket can gain warmth from each other. But how can one be warm alone? A person standing alone can be attacked and defeated, but two can stand back to back and conquer. And three are even better, for a triple braided cord is not easily broken. So, there's a way to make life feel meaningful. That's to open ourselves up to the risk of being in relationship with other people. And the rewards we get from that make life meaningful. So I reach out for connection, not with just my spouse and my family, but with a community of like-minded spiritual travelers. That brings us meaning. And the other thing he says that brings us meaning is seeking an understanding of whatever God means. Now, he's very clear. He has a very clear understanding of what God means in his context. But for us, what we can take from this is we seek meaning in our discussions and our reflections and our trying to understand what all of this means. So trying to connect with whatever God is, the divine spirit of the universe, or whatever is at work around us, how do we connect to that? Those two things, companionship with each other and seeking connection to that which is larger than us, brings meaning. Interesting. I think it's also interesting that if you think about the Buddhists, in some ways, they're saying the same thing. He says life is meaningless. They say life is suffering. What causes my suffering? My attachments. To what? Power, money, love, work, whatever it is. Whatever those things that we think that are outside of us that will give our spirits a sense of peace. Those attachments. How do I limit my suffering? I let go of my attachments. How do I do that? By right thought. It's an eightfold path. By right thinking, by right meditation, by right livelihood, by right speech. There is a book on how to live. There is a roadmap for us. Just as the Taoists say, there is a way of being in the world. And when you align with it, life will get infinitely easier. And I think I've shared this here before. That idea of being on a canoeing trip and pulling off to the sandbar for everybody to stretch and do what everybody has to do, it's almost impossible to fight the urge to walk out into the river unless the thing's 15 feet deep. Most of the rivers around here aren't. You walk into the river, it's really hard to fight the impulse to turn around and walk upstream, just to feel the pressure of that water coming against you. You really see kids doing it, but I guess I'm a kid, I do it too. Gonna push against it. And you get to a point where you go, okay, enough is this. You look back and you see all the people at the sandbar, and you decide to sit down, and what happens? It's effortless getting back to the sandbar because you're not fighting against everything. You're going with the flow of things. That's how I understand the Tao. And so when you take these three things together, you look at it and say, life gets lifey. How do we deal with this? How do we bring meaning to it with each other? By being in a community like this, by seeking, but also by aligning ourselves with spiritual principles, right? And if we do that, our lives get more complete and satisfying. And I think it's a beautiful thing when you think about our spiritual principles of recognizing the inherent worth and dignity of other people and trying to bring compassion and ethics into everything we do in the democratic process and being good stewards of the environment. All of those things are a good roadmap for us And I wonder sometimes why we are so small and everybody else is so big. It's almost like we should be the wind. We should be the people sharing our message. Life isn't always easy, but we do bring meaning to it. Each and every one of us do. There's a way to do that. And I think one really good roadmap for us is what we've all agreed to affirm in our lives and in society at large, those Unitarian Universalist principles. Okay. So,